Howdy folks, welcome back. This is Mr. Miller here. This is a video for Regents U.S. History on the 22nd, Wednesday the 22nd of April. So what we have today is going to be wrapping up topic 15 notes. So we're going to be done with topic 15 notes after this video. As a result of that, I will post the master notes along with this video. So that'll be there for you to fill in any gaps that you might have missed from watching these notes videos. So without further ado, we'll get into topic 15 notes into number 14. So before we get there, I need to explain this picture here. So if you are an astute observer of my classroom when we're in class, I have this picture. I have a poster of it on the chalkboard over to the side of the room, on the side where the door is. And so you might have been wondering what this picture is all about. So I'll explain the story right now. So this happened in 1948. So in 1948, Harry Truman, who's pictured here, Harry Truman was running for re-election as the Democrat in 1948, like I said, for president. So he was up against a guy with the last name of Dewey. And so Dewey was a Republican, and Dewey was involved in trying to take over the presidency for the Republicans. Now, this race was super, super close. Nobody was really sure who was going to win. And the problem was, back then, they didn't really have an immediate news cycle that, I mean, when you go and look up news, you can just go and search on your phone really quickly exactly what's happened, and they'll tell you all the details right up to the minute. So the problem is, at this point, you got to rely on a newspaper, and newspapers only came out 2 times a day, once in the morning, and then sometimes newspapers did 2, where they would have one in the evening too. When you are writing a newspaper, you need to have time for it to print. You need to have time for it to, show up. There's a deadline for the printing. Problem was, at this point, the election was lasting into the evening of election night. Nobody was really sure who was going to win. So newspapers were reaching their deadline times, and they had to kind of make decisions. They say, okay, we're just going to run with this headline and say Truman wins or Dewey wins, and then we hope we're right. So this picture here shows the headline there, Dewey defeats Truman. Ultimately, Truman ends up actually winning this election. So half of the newspapers here, or well, maybe not half of them, but some of the newspapers were wrong about their headline because they said that Dewey had won. So this picture here, you've got the Chicago Daily Tribune, Chicago Tribune, which is the biggest paper in Chicago still today. We had talked about the Chicago Tribune back when we were talking about the American Railway strike, the Pullman strike, back in January, I think that was. But this Chicago Tribune, they said, okay, Dewey defeats Truman. And so somebody gave Harry Truman this copy of this newspaper. And so here he is holding up a copy of a newspaper saying Dewey defeats Truman, and he is smiling about it because he knows it's a lie, it's false. And so the real story is Truman wins. Truman gets to be president for 4 more years. So that's just kind of a fun little quirky story that, I don't know, happened in 1948. That's an interesting thing. Okay, now let's get on to number 14 now. Okay, so number 14, we have Suburbs and Highways. Suburbs and Highways. As the late 1940s and 1950s roll around, this is a big time of prosperity. I had already said that this was an economically prosperous time. The economy is doing really, really well in the late 1940s, early 1950s. We just got out of the Depression. We've crawled out of that. We're just off the heels of our victory in World War II, and we're doing really well. So this is a prosperous time. And the prosperity ends up kind of flowing outward into the people. Not just the country, but normal people feel this prosperity. So people's standard of living was improving. People's lives were getting better and better and better. As a result, people make more money, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But people make more money. People have opportunities to move around a little bit more. So kind of one of the things that a lot of people decided to do during this time was to move to the suburbs. The suburbs are those areas right outside of the city where you're close enough to be able to work in the city, but you live outside of the city. So you live in the suburbs, you live in those places that are quieter, they're nicer, they've got trees and yards, and it's just a nicer place to live than in a city. So suburbs became kind of the norm for a lot of Americans. Oftentimes these people would buy mass-produced houses. So basically how this would work, a certain company would get a contract to build a certain number of houses, and they would just go from one house to the other, building the same exact house or very similar houses. I remember telling you guys about this beforehand, before all this quarantine stuff happened. But you get all of these mass-produced houses, and these houses that are all very, very similar to each other. And so that's the norm. That's what people are buying. They're buying these cookie-cutter houses, and they are moving in, and they're really happy about it because they can get out of the city. Now, here we've got a couple pictures. This picture on the left is showing this suburb that just got opened up. And so they all are moving in on the same exact day. And so as far as you can see down this road, you've got moving vans. And moving vans would have been filled up with people's possessions, and they're unloading and putting stuff into their houses. So that's kind of an interesting thing, a cool thing. And then here's a layout of a suburb on the other slide there. Now, part of the deal with the suburbs is you have to have an easy way to transport people back and forth to each other. So we end up passing or creating under the president at the time. His name is Dwight D. Eisenhower. Dwight D. Eisenhower creates what is called the Interstate Highway Act. The Interstate Highway Act. The Interstate Highway Act creates, and I'll pull this back up, so pause it if you need it. The Interstate Highway Act creates this system of highways that run between the states. Again, that's interstate, travel across state lines. So you have interstates like Route 81, like Route 90, like Route 88, like Route 87, 86, 87's over in Albany, 86, like Route 690, like Route 590 and 490 and 390 and all of those, okay? There's so many interstates that are all over the country now. But you can see here, we've got a map of the original plans of route or of the interstates. You can see Route 81 kind of cuts down there, ends in Tennessee here. So 81 curls around there, but Route 90 is there too. So you can see those interstates. Now the interstates, again, connect the country easier. It's like a little spider web that surrounds the country. It allows you to travel faster and get places quicker. Also, this allows people to commute back and forth. You don't need a streetcar, you don't need a trolley, you don't need a subway to be able to get in and out of the city. You can just take the interstate right into downtown wherever you're going, downtown Buffalo or Syracuse or downtown New York City. You can take the interstates right downtown. These are also kind of a defense thing, a defense plan. So think about it this way. If you have a bunch of people in a city and those people are the target of a nuclear attack and you need to get people out of that city very fast, you better have big roads that you can transport a lot of people on very, very quickly. So they have emergency detours that are set up on these roads. If you're driving in and out of Rochester, there's emergency detours that are posted on the sides of Route 90 that you can see, okay, yeah, this is where people would go if they needed to get out of here if something bad happened. There's also kind of a side note is these roads are very wide, they are very flat, and if you needed them to be used for like landing a plane on, you could do that. Landing a military jet, you could do that. So that's kind of like a secondary usage for these roads. We just think of them as, okay, that's the fastest way for me to get to Syracuse is by going to Homer and then going up Route 81. That's the fastest way. But if I think about it, okay, they serve other purposes. They get people faster or around faster. They get people out of Syracuse faster. And they would also serve as a wide spot for military products to be transferred very quickly, or also serving as like landing strips for planes if necessary. So it's kind of a cool sort of system that's set up. Now, number 15. Okay, number 15, the baby boom. The baby boom was a time period in American history. It's a generation. We think of generations as 18-year time spans between 1 year and another year. And so if you're born within those 18 years, you are a member of that generation. This generation, 18 to 20 years. That's kind of the turnaround here. All based on when people used to have kids. Most people don't have kids at 18 anymore. Some people do, but most don't. So just like we have the millennial generation, of which I'm a part of, just like we have the Gen Z, which you guys are all a part of, that were born like after the year 1997-ish, 1996, 1997. That's where kind of the cutoff for Gen Z is. We have generations. So the baby boom is a generation, but it is a very well-known generation because baby boomers happen to have very high numbers of birth rates during those years. So there were a lot of kids born during the years right after World War II. The baby boom starts 1946 and ends in 1964. So 1946 to 1964, that's 18 years, the 18 years right after World War II, because World War II ended in 1945, and this starts in the next year. So people are coming home. People are, soldiers are coming home. It's a prosperous time. It's a decent time to be living in America. It's a good time. So out of that prosperity, people have kids. You are, I guess, as a family, more likely to bring more kids into the world if you think things are going really well for the country. If you don't think things are going that great, you have very low birth rates. So that's kind of how it goes. Okay, high birth rates during this time because things are going well. There were 76 million babies born during these 18 years. 76 million Americans. Now, at the height of the baby boom, it was 1957. There were 4.3 million Americans born in 1957. That is one baby every 7 seconds in America. One baby every 7 seconds in the country. There were more babies being born than people were dying, so our population is just skyrocketing here. You can see here a couple pictures. This picture of all the nurses who have like nervous grins on their face because they know that eventually they're going to have to care for these 20 kids who are laying on this bed here. And so I don't necessarily know if I'd like to sign up for that job, but they look some of them look nervous. This lady in particular looks very nervous. And then here you've got birth records. Okay, so the red years in red are the baby boomers. So these birth rates, these are in millions. So 3.5 million, almost 4 million. There were a number of years that were over 4 million, and then boom, right back down, drops right back down. But before that, you can see during World War I and even before, we were down into the 2 millions. So baby birth rates are like doubled at this point from what they were just 5 years ago. It's really quite crazy. Now, with all these baby boomers being born, the population starts to shift a little bit. Okay, so there is a certain area, and I didn't write it up here, but through the magic of television, I'm going to write it up here right. Okay, mission accomplished. There is a growth of an area that's called the Sun Belt. Okay, growth of an area called the Sun Belt. So the Sun Belt here is pictured in this slide over here. Sun Belt is the bottom areas of the country. There's like 12-ish states that are involved. You could even include, Arkansas is partly included, Tennessee, North Carolina. You could trend it upwards a little bit, but they figure anywhere between 10 and 15 states that are part of the Sun Belt. The Sun Belt experiences very high population growth during this time. People are migrating away from places in the Northeast and in the North where it's cold and snowy, and it's kind of annoying when it snows on April 21st. That's kind of annoying. So people move south because, okay, well, it's a nice place to live. So move south to the Sun Belt. There are also a bunch of people who are making a lot more money at this point. The wages, the average American income pretty much doubles at this point. So Americans at this point are making about $5,500. That's a family income. So the family, most of the time it was just the man's wages, because we'll talk about that in a second, the idea of the ideal family. But $5,500 at this point was twice as much as they were making before the 1940s and 50s came along. So people have a lot more money, improves the standard of living, and as a result, people are able to buy new things. Things like stoves, things like refrigerators, things like washers and dryers, things like televisions, which would be a key thing that I would write down. Probably should have said televisions first. But those sorts of things are what people are buying. Now, 90% of the American people own a television by the year 1960. Okay, 90% of all Americans own a television by the end of the 1950s. So that's a pretty noteworthy thing. And we'll talk about the effects that television has on American society next in number 16. But before we get there, I want to talk about the ideal family. So pictured on the left, you have a picture about, rather than like what would have been like an old school radio in the corner and the whole family's gathered around, you have the family gathered around the TV watching the show. The man is sitting there. He's smoking a cigar. I apologize for showing an image of smoking here. He's smoking a cigar. The kids are sitting there watching the show. The wife is up serving them. She looks like she's got a tray of food in her hand or something, a tray of something in her hand. So this is like, in a nutshell, this is a picture that would be kind of considered the ideal family. The ideal family, what I think of in my head is this picture that's over to the right. This picture over here. The ideal family, I think of a few things. I think of a man and a wife, husband and wife. You've got the man's there. He's wearing a suit, nicely taken care of, clean shaven. The wife is there as well, looks nice herself. You've got two kids. You've got a boy and a girl. You don't ever have a boy and a boy, or a girl and a girl. You have a boy and a girl, one of each. That's the ideal family. You have a brand new house in the background in the suburbs. You have a white picket fence that they're standing in front of. You've got a brand new car in the driveway. You've got a TV in the living room like they would have in that other picture on the screen there. That's the ideal family. That is what Americans wanted out of this time. That is what a lot of Americans thought they were going to end up with and wanted to end up with. Now, you've got this kind of idea where you've got these gender roles that are kind of solidified at this point. Gender roles being the man is the breadwinner, the wife is the homemaker. Okay, so that's just kind of the roles that were established in the 1950s, and there's kind of efforts to break that a little bit. But that kind of is where a lot of our current present day gender roles come from. The idea that men are failures in their family if they don't make more than their wife does, which is kind of antiquated, but some people feel that still. So it's just kind of a thing that a lot of people feel. But that's kind of a carryover from this time. The wife, it wouldn't have really been that acceptable for her to go to work when she's got a husband and kids that she needs to take care of at home. So it's just an interesting thing, and this was the norm back then in the 1950s. So by no means does this have to be what it is now, but it is the norm back then. Now, let's talk about education and television. Like I said, education, we end up with $1 billion given to the schools in the 1950s to help out kind of as the Soviets are expanding into space. So $1 billion to fund science and math education to help us kind of catch up to the Soviets a little bit. So that's all I really want to say about education. Television changing society. Okay, there is a bunch of new shows that come out by television or on television. Most famous one was a TV show called I Love Lucy, which you could probably still find on some reruns on TV if you still subscribe to cable, if you're not a cord cutter. But I Love Lucy, it's a funny old show. You should watch it, at least something about it. It's a funny show with Lucille Ball. It's a good one. So I Love Lucy is the most popular show at this point. Families are devoting a bunch of time to sitting down and watching these shows, and it's just a fun thing for them. Also, as a result, most Americans are kind of watching the same things. When you have advertisements that come on the TV, they convince people to buy the same things. There's a saying that kind of comes out of this time period that is called keeping up with the Joneses. Keeping up with the Joneses. The Joneses are just the most common last name in America is Jones. I think still. It was a handful of years ago. But the Joneses are kind of those next door neighbors that always have the nicest things, and they're always they always look neat, and they've always got the coolest toys and the coolest show, or they're doing the coolest things, and they're dressed the best. So you want to keep up with them because it's kind of, keeping up appearances. So they call it keeping up with the Joneses. So this whole idea kind of leads to a national culture, which I have written down here. National culture, okay? Similar to a mass culture, I guess you could probably call it either. We've talked about a mass culture with this class before, but a national culture, a shared culture across all most whatchamacallits, lifestyles. So yeah, that's a mass culture, a shared culture, a national culture. Now, number 17, on to some society things that are happening here. Okay, how is society shifting around during the 1950s? There are a group of people that I got to talk about. They're called the Beatniks. Okay, the Beatniks. The Beatniks are a group of writers and artists. They're kind of refusing to conform to American society at this point. They say, wow, look at what American society is doing. We don't want to kind of buy into that. Okay, this is like beatniks would be like hipsters before hipsters were a thing. So beatniks are kind of, they're too cool to be part of. They're too cool to be part of the rest of society. So they kind of throw off those social norms and all these things. You would never catch a beatnik. They would not be caught dead being a family like this. A beatnik would never sign up for that. So beatniks, again, they dress, act, think differently. A lot of Americans think that they're wild and rebellious and look at them that way. So it is a kind of an interesting thing. Now, there is also new forms of music that come out of this. Rock and roll would be the main one. Rock and roll. We've got two guys pictured in these images. This gentleman in the middle playing the guitar, his name is Chuck Berry. Chuck Berry happens to be kind of one of the, I guess, the godfather of rock and roll, you might say. He's one of the main guys involved in rock and roll. The other guy is, of course, Elvis Presley, who I also wrote his name up there. So both of those guys very active in rock and roll and very, very much, I don't know, kind of the forefathers of rock and roll. Now, let's talk about some of the things with urban decay here, and then we'll be done. So a lot of the time, the people moving to the suburbs, moving out of the cities, those were the middle class people. So if you are a middle class person and if you have some level of wealth, you move out of the city and you move into the suburbs because you can afford to. And why would you live in the city when you could live in the suburbs and still live close to the city, but not be in the middle of that gross, sweaty area that's called the city, gross, stinky, whatever. So the city is kind of goes downhill here. Urban areas tend to become more impoverished at this point because any of the people who had any money leave the city. So what do you do with taxes? Oh, well, they took all their tax money with them because they don't pay taxes to the city anymore. They pay taxes to whatever town they live in, whatever suburb they live in. So governments try to refresh these areas or try to build up these areas a little bit. Okay, they build parks in cities and try to build highways. But what ends up happening is they do more harm than good, because when you build a highway through a city, you need to tear down people's houses and you divide communities. And that's a big issue. If you guys have paid attention to one of the things happening in Syracuse, Route 81 cuts right through the middle of Syracuse. And a lot of people are very upset about that, in saying that Syracuse has kind of been divided, and there's one side that's decent to live on, and the other side isn't that great. So you end up with kind of divided territories, and the highway that was supposed to make it easier for people to kind of get in and out of the city ended up causing more issues than it actually helped. Now, like I said, this is kind of still seen today. Syracuse has had a big to-do about this recently. I'm sorry, that's the first yawn today. I'm doing pretty well, actually. However, there's a lot of middle-class people and upper-class people who are trying to move back into cities in some cases. Cities are trendy places to live nowadays, but they are years behind where we probably should be in terms of getting the cities back to be functioning and functioning well. So these cities are still problem areas. High crime, low income, all those things that kind of go hand in hand with each other. So these areas are not the greatest, and a lot of our efforts in America are trying to improve those cities. So we still see the effects of this today. So I'm going to be done there. Finished up topic 15. So I have one essential question for you to answer. I apologize it ran a little long, but I have one essential question for you to answer. So if you could go ahead and jump over to that page on Google Classroom and go in and answer that question. I would be grateful for that. And then I will see you guys back here tomorrow. We're going to be working on the crossword tomorrow. So I'll see you guys then. Take care.